This video analyzes Ray Dalio's economic warning for educational purposes only. This is analysis, not financial advice. Ray Dalio just issued the warning nobody wanted to hear. The man who's been managing money for 5 decades, the guy who called the 2008 crisis, just went public with his most serious prediction yet. He's calling it an economic heart attack, and he says it's hitting America within 3 years. 3 weeks ago, Dalio published what he considers his most important economic analysis. Rather than his usual measured diplomatic language, he's using direct terminology that reflects the severity of his concerns about America's fiscal trajectory. America's national debt reached $37.5 trillion. Congressional Budget Office projections show 2025 spending at $7 trillion against $5 trillion revenue. However, it's worth noting that CBO projections often change based on policy decisions and economic conditions. The U.S. risks experiencing significant economic disruption within the next 3 years if the deficit, currently about 7.5% of GDP, isn't substantially reduced. He believes this requires urgent policy attention. Every single year, America borrows about 40% of what it spends. Using a household analogy, imagine earning $50,000 yearly but spending $70,000, while owing $375,000 and needing to borrow more each year just to pay interest on existing debt. While this analogy helps illustrate the fiscal challenge, it's important to note that national economics differs from household budgets in significant ways. Governments can issue currency, refinance debt more easily, and operate with different constraints than individuals. Dalio provides a specific timeline for his concern. He anticipates a debt-induced crisis could occur within the current administration's term, potentially within 2 to 3 years. This represents his assessment based on current fiscal trajectories and historical patterns he's observed. What distinguishes Dalio's analysis from typical economic predictions is his focus on structural mechanics rather than general warning. He's examining how fiscal crises actually develop and unfold based on historical precedents. The U.S. deficit needs to decrease from a projected 7.2% of GDP to approximately 3% of GDP, according to Dalio's analysis. This represents a substantial fiscal adjustment that would require significant policy changes. America needs to reduce its deficit by more than half to achieve what Dalio considers fiscal sustainability. He anticipates this will require major policy development, though it's worth noting that economists hold varying views on optimal deficit levels and debt sustainability threshold. Here's the structural challenge Dalio identified. As of mid-2025, the U.S. national debt has surpassed $37 trillion. The acceleration in debt growth concerns him more than the absolute number. Currently, America pays over $1 trillion annually just in interest on existing debt. That's before any spending on infrastructure, defense, social programs, or other government functions. It's similar to making minimum payments on credit cards while taking advances to cover basic expenses. But the U.S. benefits from several unique factors. The dollar's reserve currency status provides advantages that other countries experiencing debt crises typically lack. America's deep capital markets, economic scale, and institutional stability offer certain buffers. As of mid-2025, the U.S. debt to GDP ratio stands at approximately 123%. This means America owes more than its entire annual economic output. For context, Japan maintains a debt to GDP ratio above 250% while managing its obligation. Though economists note Japan's situation includes unique factors like domestic ownership of most debt and different monetary policy tools. Italy and Greece have also managed high debt levels, though with varying degrees of market pressure. The fiscal situation has continued evolving throughout 2025, with various legislative proposals affecting long-term debt projection. Some analyses suggest certain policy packages could add trillions to future deficits, though final impacts depend on implementation details and economic performance. Rather than improving, Dalio observes that fiscal challenges may be intensifying. Each month without substantive deficit reduction moves the timeline closer to what he considers inevitable adjustment. Though the form and timing of such adjustments remain subjects of economic debate, Dalio understands something that many miss. There are mathematical limits to debt sustainability. He points to historical examples where countries reached points where debt became unsustainable relative to their economic capacity to service it. His reference to the 1990s fiscal policy represents more than nostalgia. It's a call for the kind of bipartisan cooperation that achieved deficit reduction during that period. Dalio warns that addressing fiscal imbalances becomes more difficult and potentially more disruptive the longer policymakers wait. The solutions that might work with early action become less viable as debt dynamics worsen. This creates what economists call a fiscal cliff, where delayed action forces more severe adjustments later. Dalio's recommended approach involves what he calls a 3% deficit plan, a combination of spending adjustments, revenue measures, and supportive monetary policy. However, implementing such changes would require reducing the deficit by more than half, necessitating significant policy coordination. Dalio outlines how fiscal sustainability crises typically develop. His analysis focuses on specific sequential challenges rather than abstract concepts. International investors might reduce their appetite for a country's bonds if fiscal sustainability appears uncertain. Countries like China and Japan, major holders of U.S. debt, make lending decisions based on return prospects and risk assessment. Reduced demand for American debt would likely increase borrowing costs. Governments facing such pressures encounter difficult policy choices: reduce spending, potentially slowing economic growth, or maintain spending while paying higher borrowing costs. Both approaches present economic and political challenges. Additionally, if fiscal management appears unsustainable, it could affect confidence in the dollar's reserve currency status. But the dollar benefits from network effects, limited alternatives, and America's economic scale, factors that provide certain stability advantages. Dalio emphasizes urgency in addressing fiscal imbalances, arguing that delay makes necessary adjustments more difficult. He suggests that comprehensive policy action may require accepting short-term economic disruption to avoid longer-term fiscal problems. It's important to consider Dalio's warnings within broader economic context. The U.S. economy demonstrates significant strength, technological innovation, demographic advantages compared to many developed countries, energy independence, and deep capital markets. Many economists argue that America's unique position, controlling the world's primary reserve currency, maintaining the deepest bond markets, and operating the most liquid financial system, provides flexibility that other countries lack when managing high debt levels. Additionally, much of U.S. debt is held domestically, and the government's ability to influence monetary policy through the Federal Reserve provides tools that aren't available to countries operating under fixed exchange rates or using foreign currency. But these advantages don't eliminate fiscal constraints entirely. Even reserve currency countries face limits on debt sustainability, as evidenced by historical examples like the British pound's loss of reserve status in the mid-20th century. Various policy approaches could address the fiscal challenges Dalio identifies. These might include revenue measures, tax policy changes, closing loopholes, or adjusting rates on different income categories. However, tax policy involves complex economic and political trade-offs, spending adjustments, reviewing discretionary and mandatory spending programs, though major spending categories like Social Security and Medicare involve significant political and practical consideration. Economic growth strategies. Policies that increase GDP growth can improve debt to GDP ratios over time, though growth alone may not address the scale of adjustment Dalio considers necessary. Monetary coordination. Federal Reserve policy can influence interest costs on government debt, though monetary policy serves multiple objectives beyond fiscal support. The effectiveness of these approaches depends on implementation details, timing, and economic conditions that are difficult to predict precisely. While Dalio's track record and analytical approach deserve serious consideration, economic predictions, even from highly successful investors, carry inherent uncertainty. Multiple factors influence economic outcomes, and policy responses can significantly alter projected trajectories. Dalio's warnings highlight legitimate fiscal policy questions that economists across various perspectives acknowledge require attention. Whether his specific timeline proves accurate, the underlying fiscal dynamics represent ongoing economic challenges worth understanding. Rather than promoting specific investments or services, Dalio appears focused on encouraging policy discussion around fiscal sustainability. His wealth and established track record suggest his motivation involves genuine economic concern rather than commercial interest. For Americans, understanding these fiscal dynamics provides useful context for policy debates and personal financial planning, regardless of which specific predictions prove most accurate.